Sally Roesch Wagner. It's June 1st, 2008. We're in the Women's Information Center in Syracuse, New York, and I'm fresh out of the garden with dirt underneath my fingernails.
Could you give us a little bit of background on yourself?
Well, I am a member of Veteran Feminists of America. Card-carrying member. Those of us who are active before 75. So my work in the women's movement was it was old by 1984 when I came to the Women's Peace Encampment. I actually helped start one of the first women's studies programs in the country at California State University, Sacramento. Taught my first women's studies class in 1970. Actually, I'm still teaching women's studies at Syracuse University, adjunct faculty. Been teaching for 38 years in women's studies, which may be longer than anyone has been teaching consecutively in women's studies. I also have one of the first 2 doctorates awarded for work in women's studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz, the History of Consciousness program. And my work was in women's studies at a time when there was no doctoral program in women's studies, and so I did interdisciplinary work there with a concentration in women's studies. And my dissertation was a biography of Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Oh. And she's been the focus of my work since 1973. I'm now the executive director of the Matilda Jocelyn Gage Foundation in nearby Fayetteville, New York. And we own her home, and we're busily bringing her back into memory. And it was in 1984 at the Seneca Women's Peace Encampment that I was arrested as Matilda Jocelyn Gage in costume as a birthing gift for my grandson, who is now 24 years old in 3 days.
So what did Matilda do at Seneca?
Well, I came out, actually, I was brought out by the Elizabeth Cady Stanton Foundation to perform during the convention days. And what I learned was that there was a real tension anyway, between the village of Seneca Falls and the Women's Peace Encampment, that there was a lot of tension between the two groups, and I thought, well, maybe I could bridge a little bit. And I wanted to do CD to welcome Michael into the world and to make the world a safer place for him. It was sort of like, how this is my first grandchild. What's the most appropriate thing that I can do? And it seemed to me to sort of put myself on the line. And so when I finished the performance, I said, and I was still in costume, I said, I'd really like to go over to the Peace Encampment and visit with the women there. So I came as Matilda Jocelyn Gage in character and had a conversation with the women at the encampment about, it was really sort of a nuts and bolts political, from a 19th century radical to her 20th century daughters. Gage always talked about her work being for the women of our time, the women who had come after. In fact, when she risked arrest in 1876, presenting the Declaration of Rights of Women that she and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had written, she said that their work was not for the women of their time, it was for the daughters of 1976, so they would know that their mothers of 1876 had impeached the government for its treatment of women. And so it seemed, if I'm in Seneca Falls, there's a peace encampment. If I was Matilda Jocelyn, what would Matilda Jocelyn Gage do? I mean, it was a no-brainer. She'd get arrested. So one of the things she also said was, when there was an earlier period, it was in January of 1876, and she was presiding at a women's rights at the National Women's Suffrage Association convention. She was the president of the organization that year, and she was at the podium, and a police officer came in and motioned her down, and wanted her to speak to him. So she got off the platform and went down to the back of the hall and talked to him, and she knew what it was about. There was a tax that they had to pay, an entertainment tax, if you had an assembly of any kind. And she had refused to pay the taxes. No taxation without representation, the suffragists, the radical suffragists were saying. And so she, was told that if she continued the convention, she would be arrested. And she turned her back on him, walked back up to the podium, said to the women and the men in the audience, it was a huge audience, a couple thousand people, I think, this gentleman has just told me I'll be arrested for not paying the entertainment tax. I refuse to pay the tax. If I am arrested, I will carry on this convention from my jail cell. And so all of the women they waved their hankies, and the men tossed their hats in the air. We'll be with you, Mrs. Gage. And he just left, and they continued the convention. And that's when they said, we have greater cause for discontent, rebellion, and revolution, the women of 1876, than did the men of 1776. And so, this is a woman who, what else would she have done? It was a small thing to get arrested, and it was just the thing to do for me personally because of the birth of my grandson. So Matilda and I went to the Seneca Army Depot. Well, after we left, I guess I'm trying to think of the timing of this. It was a Saturday, I think, when I performed. And I did the performance, I think, right after that. Somebody drove me to the Peace Encampment, did the performance, and then when I finished, I went out of character. I stayed in character for the whole performance. It was really fun because it was sort of like, so how are you dealing with the unhappiness of the locals? And yeah, that was a problem back in the 19th century. It was just this sort of back and forth of political tactics, really, and nuts and bolts. And when I finished and went out of character and was me, I said I'd like to do CD. And there was a question about whether or not I should, because the sort of rule was that you didn't do it by yourself, and it didn't seem that there was going to be anybody else there to do CD. And I was willing to do it on my own, but I also really respected that it was better to have more than one person doing it. There was one woman who was seriously thinking about it, and she sort of went back and forth. I remember she was kind of agonizing over it, ultimately decided not to, and I went ahead. I don't remember if I did it right then or if I did it the following day. I know I needed to get arrested and let go in time to catch a plane, because the next day I had to teach. I was teaching summer school in Minnesota where I lived, and so there was this sort of, well, timing, yes, it should work unless they detain you too long. Well, I don't think they will. So I went to the Army Depot, and the women did support. They agreed it was all right if I went on my own. And the Boston Women's Film Collective was there, and they filmed it as well. And so I walked in, and the doors were open, and the gates were open, and I just walked in, and the military came right over and started pulling me back and said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I want to come in and see if you really have cruise and Pershing missiles here, because they frightened me, because my grandson was just born, and I don't want those little puppies being sent over to Europe. The Europeans don't want them. I don't want you to send them, and I want to see, I'm a grandmother, and I want to see if you have missiles here." And, well, I didn't like that. They didn't buy that argument, and so they just sent me back out. And I walked back in, and they sent me back out. I think they were a little intimidated, because, I was dressed in 19th century costume. I had on a long dress. I had on a hat with a bird on it, and I wore a gray wig at the time. And I had on 19th century shoes, those spool heels. And so finally they locked the gates. So I looked up I knew I couldn't climb over the top with what I was wearing. I looked underneath and there was room for me to scoot through. And I thought, oh man, I shouldn't do this to my costume, but I got no option. So under the fence I went, and they, greeted me on the other side and put my hands behind my back and handcuffed me. In the meantime, the women from the peace encampment were on the other side of the gate, and they were singing and singing and singing to me. There was one woman that was part of the rest of me, and I decided to, just woman to woman, strike up a conversation with her or connect with her in any way that I could. And so I asked her, at one point, there was a long wait. I don't remember what that was about, but I remember just waiting around for a long time. And I had sort of this joyous feeling, it was like fun. It was like, all this music, and I thought, wow, they're singing for me to make me strong. I'm just stronger than anything in the world, with all that music coming into me. And I felt very special and very honored that they were giving me that strength. And so I asked this woman, I said, because they were banging on tins and, it was loud. And I said, does that music ever bother you? Does that ever get to you? Because it was going on and on and on. And she said, she smiled. And these guys were away, she was the only military person that was military police, I guess, that was there at the moment. And she said, no, as long as they keep singing, I've got a job. So later on, when I'm talking to her, finding out a little bit about herself, I showed her a picture. I had, when they searched me, when they finally took me into this, what looked like a chicken coop. I mean, they drove me way into the Army depot. And I thought, oh man, this is a little intimidating. I see why. You don't want to be doing this by yourself. And they put me in this thing that did look like a chicken coop. It was just wires, I remember. But that was the only way I was going to get out of this one. So, and I was in there for a long time, and I couldn't sit down. I thought about just dropping myself to the floor, but I don't think I would get up. And, when your hands are handcuffed behind your back, I'd never had my hands handcuffed behind my back for several hours before in my life. It starts getting uncomfortable, and it was hot, and my nose itched, and I couldn't scratch it, and flies were buzzing, and I couldn't get rid of them, and standing in that costume was not real comfortable. I remember this moment when I got a little scared, and it was sort of, what are they doing? Why are they taking so long? What have I done? I've been involved in anti-war activity, and I thought, man, I knew I had an FBI file. I think by that time I'd gotten my FBI file. And I knew that they knew a lot about me. And while I'd never done anything illegal before, it doesn't matter to the government. And I knew that. And all that started frightening me. It frightened me, knowing how during the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement and, that whole period of time, which was just the decade before, that, they murdered Black Panthers. They planted drugs on people that I knew. My phone was tapped, and I knew that from my FBI file. I worked with an undercover cop during that time, and I knew that from my FBI file. So all that fear from that time period, which anybody that went through that as an activist knows what that fear is, and anybody who didn't go through that as an activist doesn't. And that's what went through my mind, was the fear of that moment. I hadn't thought about that till just now. We had this is the sort of stuff that came up. we had an underground paper that was published in the collective where I lived. The house was in my name. I'd lived there first. And it turned into a collective. We rented it. And we had a split in the paper, and the other half went off to the weathermen. And they started, doing some pretty stupid stuff. And the house of another collective a half a block away was burned to the ground. And the cops, the fire marshal, said they knew it was arson. And a woman died as a result of that fire. And the local conservative paper in Sacramento, the Sacramento Union, published an article about our underground paper, and it was filled with misinformation. And it said stuff like, it preaches drugs and violence. They were talking about the Weatherman paper. They hadn't done their research. They were nailing us. And they said, the cops can't do anything about it. These liberal judges won't do anything. The newspaper is printed in a gray frame house on the corner of 23rd and L. And 6 months before, that young woman had died in the house fire a half a block away. And it was a call for vigilante action. And during that time, this would have been in the early 70s, that kind of stuff went on. My kids and I left the house that night. I mean, we didn't even spend another night in the house. And the FBI came to visit me. I knew it was them. I knew not to talk to them. They were visiting other people as well. They visited the guy that I rented from. And I developed asthma at 26. So I'm in this chicken coop in the middle of the Seneca Army Depot, my hands behind my back, handcuffed, reliving this stuff from the 70s. And, I was more than a little scared. I was scared shitless. And I think it was feeling so powerless, and it was remembering the powerlessness of that time period. And I was way in the middle there, and I wasn't hearing those women singing anymore. And I remember in that moment, this is really emotional in ways I think I had forgotten what that feeling was like. Even when I talked to my grandson about it, I really was scared. And I remember one hand, I started thinking, I'm reaching this back to Matilda Jocelyn Gage. And the other hand, I'm reaching to Michael, my grandson. And I thought, I'm just the conduit. I'm just the one in the middle right now in this moment, doing the little bit that needs to be done. And, I started thinking about, this isn't real fear. This isn't Nelson Mandela fear. This isn't the fear of people that have really put their lives on the line. I'm just getting a flake of it. And this is just what I need to be doing now. It was natural. It wasn't of course, but it was that feeling of strength with Matilda holding me and Michael holding me and knowing exactly where I stood in history. I knew exactly who I was in that moment in a really profound way. The woman, that cop, she had to search me, and she was really, I had to take my costume and pieces of it off. I don't remember how far I had to strip down, but I had to take some of my clothes off. And she was really uncomfortable about it. It was like she had to do it. I knew she had to do it. It was like, it was all right. And I had a picture of Michael in my, in my clothing, and I took it out and showed her, asked her if she had any grandkids. She had kids. She'd been a waitress before then, and she never had job security. She didn't have any health insurance. She said, this is the best job I've ever had. And I said, do you resent those women? She said, no, they are my security. I don't want them to stop doing what they're doing. They are my job security. And this was when there were no guys around. You know, none of these guys were around. And I didn't feel frightened because I made that sort of personal connection with her and found out about her kids, and you know, I told her about my kids, my grandkid, and finally they came in, and you know, gruff, the guy was rah, 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 and it was sort of like, I'm being paid to be gruff, so I'm gonna be gruff, and it was sort of, you know, it was like, get off it, you know, it was. I didn't sense that there was a meanness about him. I felt like this was a guy doing his job. And probably it was his job security too to have me there. So, but they did one mean thing. And that woman tried to talk him out of it. They took me a mile away to drop me off. When they finally, you know, and they did this whole, why don't you ever come back here again? And what do you think, you know, gave me the old talking to. And then they took me a mile away, so I had to walk down this dirt road, you know, and it was hot in July, and I wasn't really dressed for that sort of hike, but I remember when they dropped me off, she was upset at him. She was, you know, I didn't pick up the whole thing. I saw body language. I don't remember exactly how that played out, but I remember her saying to them, look, we can just take her back to the gate. You know, she's got people there, they'll pick her up. And I don't remember what they said or if I even knew it. But the next thing I knew, I was like, you know, and they said, it's back. I think I asked them, well, which way is it? You know, and they pointed, I think. And I reached out my hand to each one of them and tried to shake their hand, you know, thank you, and you know, goodbye. And those men, it was like if I'd put a gun out, they wouldn't have shied away as much. They were, you know, it was like their body language was like I'd attacked them by friendship, by, you know, there was no, it wasn't them, and I knew that, but they didn't. I think that was the difference. But the woman shook my hand. And she was a little uncomfortable about it, you know. Yeah. It was like I maybe shouldn't have tried to do it with her, because she was then torn between her allegiance to her job and the connection she'd made with me. But I didn't try to do any more contact with her while the guys were around. And so I start walking down the road, and I remember feeling really happy in that moment. You know, you come up against your own fears, you come up against your own demons, and you know, and I won that war with the demons. And one of the things when I was going through all these things that I gathered and kept, these are flowers that I picked on the road, wildflowers. And it was sort of like, I think, wanting to have some memory of that. And it was a beautiful day. It was hot, but it was really a beautiful day. And I just felt so happy in that moment. And I picked these, and I think I wanted Michael to have them, you know, to remember them by. And I was prepared to walk. You know, it was like, yeah, you know, I'm going to make this. It's a mile. You know, I'm okay. And, you know, I'm not going to die on the way, you know. So I just have a little unplanned hike here. And part way along, car drove up, and it was women from the Peace Encampment, and they picked me up. And I remember feeling really grateful to them, and also a little bit disappointed. Not disappointed, but sort of, I had my mind set on that it was part of my journey. Yeah. You know, that I needed to walk that mile. Sally Wagner, a.k.a. Matilda Jocelyn Gage, hereby notified that effective immediately ordered not to re-enter or be found within the limits of the United States military installation at Seneca Army Depot. And you know what I love about this is that I am still here. and the Seneca Army Depot is not. And Matilda Jocelyn Gage is remembered more and more, and the Seneca Army Depot is forgotten more and more. But the Women's Peace Encampment isn't. I remember I called my daughter, and I was a little nervous about calling her. I hadn't told her I was doing this beforehand. Michael's mother, and I was a little, she was a little more traditional than her mother. She spent her childhood wanting to be normal. She's now my grandson, and she and I have played around with a screenplay called Finding Normal. With the three of us trying to get a fix on this girl who really, really wanted to be normal with a very unnormal mom. So this unnormal mom's about to call and say, I just was arrested, and I call her and say, I just was arrested as a birthing gift for Michael. Without missing a beat, she said, Michael says thank you very much, but he really needs a night, a night thing. So I remember thinking, and I never did this, I really wish I would have. I remember thinking I should get one and paint stripes on it, and send it off to him, and I never got that done. But Michael then grew up. I was actually arrested later at the Nevada test site. Twice. Once as Matilda Jocelyn Gage and once as Belka Lockwood. Again, for Michael on Mother's Day. And so he grew up with this whole knowledge that, and this was the story that we told him, that you have a grandma that loves you so much that she was willing to be arrested to make the world safe for you. So when he was about 14, he had to do an interview with an elder maybe even younger than that. It was when he was in middle school, and he had to do an interview with an elder, and he asked his teacher. He said, "Well, my grandma's not quite that old, but could I do an interview with her?" And so she said, "Okay." So he starts out the interview with, of course, the first question you always ask your grandma: "Have you ever been arrested?" Because he really wanted this story of his, my arrest for him. And the only tension it ever causes in the family is that I have two other grandchildren now, and Alex is 15 and Tanner is 14. And Alex is Michael's sister, and Beth periodically will say to me, Alex feels like you love Michael more than you love her, because by the time, I think she said this when Alex was about 10, by the time Michael was Alex's age, you'd been arrested 3 times for him, and you've never been arrested for her. So it was just this, this kind of joking thing in the family. But I started thinking about it real seriously, and so I started this conversation with Alex and Tanner. They're not quite ready to have it yet, and I'm not quite ready to do it yet, because I'm doing work now with this. I'm the director of Gage Foundation. I joined the Rotary Club, and I'm becoming respectable. And I need to do this for another few years. And but then I need to get back to the work that I was doing before. So I've started the conversation with them about, I want them to think of a cause that they care more about than anything else. And when I finish this work, I'll do CD for them for that cause, so that they can be part of the choosing of it.
How cool is that?
Oh, and you know what? When you say cool, my memories of Michael doing this, interview with me, and he's, have you ever been arrested? So I start telling him this story about, how I did civil disobedience for him, and he's behind the video camera going, cool. Cool. Michael and I are, and I don't know whether it has anything to do with that, sort of putting myself on the line for him, but we have a very unusual close relationship, and spend a lot of time together. Flew him to a few years ago to Gainesville, Florida, so that we could. I was doing a lecture there, and it also. No, this was not. I've taken with me a lot of places. This wasn't that. It was Rock the Vote. There was a Rock the Vote concert with Dave Matthews and some other bands that we really like, and so I flew us both there, and we rented a red convertible and tooled around southern Florida. He lives in California, and went to the concert together and drank absinthe together. And I adore this boy. Just absolutely adore him. And he's the one that from the time he was young, I said to him that my legacy, everything that I've done and the work that I've done, I'm passing on to you. And in the German-Russian tradition that I come from, the knowledge of healers goes from female to male, female, male. It passes in that way. So we have a mythology that's the way that we're passing. I remember thinking that it felt like when in 1970, after Cambodia Kent State, I was in California State University, Sacramento, and Reagan was governor, and he closed down the campuses, and we opened up Sac State, and we set up a tent city and lived on campus until the end of the semester, and lived in tents on the quad, on the campus, moved our tents so that the groundskeepers could keep the grounds good. We didn't want to destroy the grounds. And I remember thinking it was that same sort of spirit, the spirit of everybody together, everybody with a common purpose, except it was all women, which made it much more delicious. And I remember the intensity of that exchange when we were going back and forth about, because I think what happened was it may have presented an opportunity for the women to talk about some of the tensions that were happening, both with the community and within the camp, and sort of get an historic lens through which to see it, or an historic fix on it. I remember dirt, food, women hugging each other a lot of physical contact. Felt really good to be there. I don't think I have any photos here, but there was a story in, maybe it was Off Our Backs, and there was a picture, if I remember right, I think there was a picture of me being, arrested as Gage. And I remember that there was a criticism that what was I doing? This was not a feminist activity, that the peace work was taking energy out of the women's movement. And I remember being a little bit cut by that. Okay. It was interesting. I was mentioning that to somebody today, and she said, well, it's the same thing. How could anybody think? And she's much younger, never went through that time period. And I thought, it did matter then. It was, we were really defining who we were in each of the movements. And that definition results in a lot of dynamic tension. And sometimes you get cut a little bit with it. There was a neat thing that happened when I went back to, Mankato, Minnesota to teach my class the next day. I'm obviously telling the students of what I just did. They were so inspired by it. There was this one woman that did a huge, probably the size of these windows, these double doors. it was sort of the solidarity, one and all, and it was that kind of concept. And she did a huge picture of it, she was an artist, and it was so inspiring to her that I remember getting flack, from the faculty about, that's not appropriate faculty behavior. Yeah, well, all right. I think when you do something like that, then it becomes possible for everybody around you.
Mm-hmm.
It was possible for me because Matilda Jocelyn Gage did it, and other women that I knew did it. And I think that's, courage is catching, and it's also highly overrated. I remember people saying, wow, that was really courageous, or something like that. And it was almost like, oh, come on, get out of here. That is a deadly comment about our culture. If my doing that tiny piece is considered courageous, then we are in deep shit. Because that should be, an act like that should be the starting point. It should be, anything less than that is not acceptable. If you care about the world, you at least need to be willing to do that. And that should be just not even anything you think much about or talk much about. And it was almost insulting for people to say that was courageous, because real courage is something very different than that. And I think the other thing is that when social change, you realize at some point that your parents and your teachers were wrong. This really isn't a fad. This is like a lifestyle. At that point, I've had conversations with Mary Daly about this, that I think that and she looks at it physiologically, that the tracking of behavior, the more you do it, the more it just becomes a normal, easy thing to do. But I need now, because I need to bring Matilda Jocelyn Gage back to memory. This is a woman who, her work, the small honoring I did of her by repeating her life in her name, it's a fraction of who she was. She was fearless, she had foresight, she was brilliant, and it's my life's work to bring her back to memory, not by myself, but I really have another stage of this that I need to do. But what it's meant is that I've had to get away from some of the other work that I've done. I don't want to muddy the waters by, when I was a faculty member, I didn't care what people thought about my being arrested or not. But now, the work that I'm doing is really for Gage, and it's really for the bringing, the future having her. And I need to stay out of the way of that, to not put my own stuff into that. But my promise to myself to do this work, and what allows me to do it, is that as soon as I have this foundation through the growth stage and into maturity, which will be 3 to 5 years, I dye my hair blue and I get arrested. I mean, it's bam, like that, And that's the thing that keeps me being able to do this, is the knowledge that I can get back to my life. And my life requires, making the stand of things that matter. And hopefully my grandkids, it'd be really neat to get them involved in the process, so they can see this is how you do it, and this is, this is what you do. NCD isn't the only thing, but it's that, when that option is off the table, they're just, it's a range of things that aren't possible for you, aren't available. So I want to be really courageous. I want to do something really courageous. That's not really courageous. I want to be really courageous. When we have historic amnesia, we don't have a future. I think what I knew in that moment when when Gage was behind me and Michael was in front of me, I understood myself more deeply than I think most non-Native people ever do. I think Native people live with that knowledge. My Native friends, they absolutely know who they are, because they absolutely know where they come from, and they know where they're going. And I think part of the way that we're controlled and disempowered today is by not knowing where we come from and not knowing where we're going. And so each minute we're reinventing ourselves, which means that we can never create a future. Knowing, here's a specific. I hated the history of the suffrage movement. It bored me silly. You know, women on their knees for 72 years asking for the right to vote. You know, what did it mean anyway when we got it? You know, the vote was, well, it seems to now be understood to mean more than it to radicals in the 1970s. Then it was, you know, we have no say, we have no voice, we got to take control of the government before we can, you know, have our vote mean anything. And I think there's still elements of that. You know, is it really going to change the nature of the world? Hopefully this election will, but hopefully every election that I've ever voted in will. And it doesn't always make a difference what party it is. It's discouraging, but so the vote just never really struck me as anything significant. But that was the only history we had, was Susan B. Anthony and the vote. And then I discover Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and this is a woman who says the vote's half a loaf. The vote is simply a tool that we'll use. And she uses these brilliant tactics of heightening the contradiction of what the government is pushing. And, you know, it's like it's the 100th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party. La-di-da. Well, guess what? We are taxed without representation. We'll start a tax protest. You know, it's a 100th anniversary of a republic based on the consent of the government. I have never given my consent to this government. I'm impeaching the government for its treatment of women. This woman was politically brilliant. And that's only in terms of the vote. But she never saw that as an end. She's dealing with equal pay for equal work. She's dealing with, it's a crime against the mother and a sin against the child to bring an unwanted child into the world. I mean, this is a woman who writes about trafficking in women using that language in 1893. She exposes that Catholic priests are sexually abusing children and women. And that it's part of the legacy of Catholicism. It's part of the legacy of the unnatural and dangerous power that priests are given as the emissaries of God. She gets it. She gets everything that we're dealing with today. Now, if we don't know that history, if all we know is la-di-da the vote, you know, 72 years, we're clueless. We don't know that this reproductive rights issue is as old as the women's movement. That in 1872 we lost the right to reproductive rights because the religious fundamentalists got control of determining what was obscene in the United States of America in the form of Anthony Comstock. And we didn't have birth control for 100 years, not because it wasn't available. I mean, every safe and effective form of birth control, from condoms to cervical caps, not just diaphragms, cervical caps, spermicides, the Today sponge, for God's sake, you know. I mean, men were sponge-worthy in 1850, and then along come the religious fundamentalists, and we lose all that. We don't know that history, we're clueless. And that's the history we don't know, and that's the passion that drives me with Gage. And that's what took me underneath the Seneca Army Depot fence as Matilda Jocelyn Gage, because had she been alive, she would have been doing it. Matilda's daughter, Maud, was going to Cornell. Matilda helped open the door to Cornell for women, and her daughter, she wasn't able to go to college. Matilda wasn't. Her daughter's going. All three of her daughters have gone. Maud's going to finish at Cornell and then go to law school. She falls in love with this guy her sophomore year, decides to drop out of school, and her mother goes ballistics. And, you know, this guy is like, he's really sweet, but he's never going to be able to support a family. And she's dropping out of school. She's not going to be able to. What are they going to do? Live on love? Yeah, well, that's what they plan to do. So she, you know, okay. He goes bankrupt several times, and finally he listens to his mother-in-law when she says, you know, Frank, those stories that you tell, they had 4 sons, that you tell the boys, they are so good, you need to write them down. The year after her death, he published The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Now, that's just the beginning of it, because if you read the 14 Oz books, they are books of peace and social justice for kids. They're brilliant. They're really, it's a matriarchy, and everybody gets what they need and gives what they can. The only rule is that you behave yourself, you are thoughtful of other people, and there's all kinds of philosophical issues that get, including vegetarianism. Gage was a vegetarian. Frank loved his breakfast meat. And she spent every winter of her life after her husband died in 1884, 2 years after Frank and Maud were married. She spent every winter with Frank and Maud. And so, you know, she really had a deep influence on him. And she's we call her the wonderful mother of Oz. She is the Dorothy.